All right, we are live. I'm with Wendy Patrick, PhD, who somehow is still a prosecutor, is on the air all the time, manages to write a column on Psychology Today. And I was like, oh, I wonder how long this has been going on. And I looked, it's like almost a daily column, it appears, and is kind enough to appear here. How do you fit it all in? And how are you doing today?
Oh, Eric, I'll tell you, how do I fit it in? The good Lord, number one. And number two, I am just blessed with a very understanding family and a lot of energy, maybe in reverse order of importance. But no, you have a great show. Thank you for sending me the link to check it out. And thank you for what you do. You really are an inspiration and encouragement to so many people who would like to have easy access to all different types of content. That's what you provide.
Well, thank you. That's too kind. And there's kind of a funny story how I came across you. Um, One of the guests who's been on the show a lot of times is Robert Barnes, and I was watching him on another podcast. Robert Barnes is a world famous attorney. I mean, very, very well known here in the States. But he was recommending a book, and the book he recommended was called Red Flags, and it was in essence, I think the book is Red Flags: How to Tell If Your Daughter's Dating a Loser. And I'm into human behavior and that kind of thing, and I've had a lot of FBI agents and stuff like that. So I'm always going to go look. But I didn't find that book. I found your Red Flags, which is awesome because that's actually right on target. It's red flags, frenemies, underminers, and ruthless people. And I was like, ooh, this is something that I like. This is exactly what I do because I have, psychologists like James Fallon on, who was the guy who discovered that he was a psychopath by reading his own brain scans. And so it's right
I'm
down that
familiar
line.
with that story. Yeah, fascinating.
So what inspired you? And I definitely want to go down that path of your book to start. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, the very first thing that inspired me was 20 years of being a prosecutor. I was a defense attorney before that. And
Mhm.
it always was fascinating to me how so many worldly, knowledgeable, intelligent people made such poor choices personally. None of us are immune from doing that. I've never met anybody, myself included, that hasn't had lapses in judgment because we're too close to the problem or the person. So my book kind of encompasses the first book that you said you were looking for, because it's true. We look at
Mhm.
our sons and daughters and say, what do you see in so and so? Don't you see the things that I'm seeing? We trade in our reading glasses for rose-colored glasses when we become too close to someone, or we like the way they look, or more importantly, we like the way they make us feel. Very
Mhm.
intoxicating. So, midway through my career, I started thinking a little bit more about it. I ended up going back to school. I went to seminary and got a master's in divinity degree. And then I went
In
to get
Wales.
my PhD
In
in
Wales.
Wales. That's
You
right.
went to Wales to get a degree?
Yeah, that's right. In the UK, that Wales. And then after that, my thesis, by the way, was in the psychology of attraction, which is really what we're talking
Mhm.
about.
Mhm.
So although the topic was theology, the practical application of it is something you and I and all of our viewers and listeners use every day. So then, of course, as anybody listening knows, once you get a PhD and write a thesis, you got to turn that thing into a book. You didn't waste all those years for nothing. So that was one of the things that led me to the first iteration, which was originally called How to Spot Frenemies, Underminers, and Toxic People. Then, of
I
course,
was noticing that.
we turned that into the ruthless people, because that is almost a sign of the times, and that you almost have to be ruthless to take advantage of others and exploit others. And I would love to impart any knowledge and wisdom I've learned over the years, both academically and practically, to be able to help others from making the same mistakes.
Okay, now in the book you talk about the Dark Triad, and in your column you talk about the triad and the tetrad. Do you want to go into that a
Right.
little bit?
Well, the dark personalities. Now, those are fascinating to most people because anytime you use the word dark in a sentence, the dark side, people become intrigued. That's human nature.
Of
But
course.
there is nothing that is light about the Dark Triad. There's nothing uplifting. There's nothing funny. There's nothing even personable except on a very superficial level, which I'll get into in a minute, about the Dark Triad. We are talking about psychopaths, narcissists, Machiavellianists, and we're talking about sadists. That is the Dark Tetrad. So, for example, anybody with a Machiavellian personality, we'll take that one first because most people haven't heard of that.
I have to poke on that for a second, though. You know, poor Machiavelli has been buried. He really was not an evil person per se, but his name has sort of been dragged through the mud. His is all about like, this is how you survive in the halls of power. And I don't know. I think that,
Eric, that is such a funny point. How would you like to have a dark personality named after you?
The only thing worse is spam.
Oh, I'm sure that's true. There'll be, those are the types of things that evolve over the years, largely because phrases are coined as our last names. Yeah, I know you make a good point there. But it has come to be characterized as this sort of cold, calculating personality, strategic, not in a good sense, in a very negative sense. Psychopathy, as many of our viewers and listeners know, that has been sensationalized in TV and the movies. But clinically, it is about this issue of not really having the type of moral compass that we would like to have. It doesn't necessarily mean you're a criminal, though there are different scales of psychopathy. And in fact, there are many psychopaths, or maybe I should more accurately say, people that exhibit psychopathic traits or have psychopathic tendencies in business.
Well, there's the hair scale. And you've got 30 parameters, and some may have 20 or 18 versus 29 or whatever.
And you need a certain amount to be diagnosed clinically, but not to operate in the world. And so psychopathy is very misunderstood, but that's one of the other dark personalities. Then we get to narcissism, and everybody likes talking about narcissism because we all like to think, oh, I know a narcissist. Many people read the description and say, well, I have some characteristics of narcissism. And where do you draw the line between narcissism and healthy self-esteem? Well, clinically, of course, this is a disorder that's grandiose. These are people that don't care about others. And I could go on clinically what the DSM-5 says. But in terms of narcissistic traits, very different, kind of like the hair scale. There are scales of narcissism. You don't have to have all of them, but it's this focus on self. If we were to take it to a very deep level. And, I come at this, of course, from a Christian standpoint. So it would be do only unto yourselves and don't care about how you do unto others. So it's a very self-centered viewpoint. Now, sadism, we recognize that as enjoying when others suffer, inflicting pain on others. And that has become sort of a part of the dark personalities, the constellation of dark personalities, because when you really look at it, it's different than some of the others. It's even different than psychopathy, where there isn't this added element of enjoying inflicting pain. Psychopaths, many of them just don't care one way or another. It's not that they have that extra element that you need to be a sadist. Now, why are we talking about all this in a book I wrote that is entitled Red Flags? Because many of these traits are hidden. We have to know how to decipher the person behind the persona. For example, psychopaths, narcissists, they are very flashy and fun. They're the kind of people you like having at parties. You enjoy conversation with them because it's animated. They're very superficially charming, and that they make you feel good about yourself. They're usually the life of the party, especially narcissists. But Red Flags is about how not to be fooled by what you see and hear initially, how to look under the surface, to learn more before you get any closer.
It's interesting too. Now, one thing that I've heard many times, and it kind of sounds true to me, but I'm not trained to that degree, and that's that not every narcissist is a psychopath, but every psychopath is a narcissist.
Well, I think I know that many psychologists wouldn't agree with that, but I also know that many of our viewers and listeners would. And that's what I mean by there's a little bit of crossover within the dark personalities. And many people believe that they know people that exhibit traits in one or more on the dark triad and dark personalities. That is why you see me writing so many Psychology Today articles on things like just recently, last week, how dark personalities respond to the pandemic, dark and darker. But those are the types of things that help us decide what we're dealing with. And part of the other reason we talk about the overlap, as you mentioned, is because it's also true that that self-centeredness, that not caring about the feelings of others, the lack of empathy, that ties together several of the dark personalities, including psychopathy and narcissism.
Yeah, and that was another point. I think it might have been Jim Clemente, the FBI agent who's also in Criminal Minds or behind it. He had mentioned that Ted Bundy, to him, is not a psychopath, but a sadist. And he differentiated, and I had never heard it before, but as he was saying that there are people who enjoy, you have to have empathy to recognize that you're causing pain in somebody else, to get the joy out of it. And it's really a dark, I mean, that's like dark on dark, but a true psychopath a lot of times is just, they just don't care. They can kill or do whatever, but they're not necessarily taking joy out of that like a sadist.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that it's a dark triad and then a dark tetrad, because as you point out, and as Jim points out, sadism is entirely different in that regard, very different than the other three. So we had to make it a tetrad. I mean, if you and I are doing this podcast 10 years from now, maybe it'll be a septad. We'll have 7. There are just
another last name, by the way, Marquis de Sade. He probably deserved it, though.
Yeah, that's true. Here we go again, right? Another last name. And narcissists. So we've got 3 out of the 4. Remember looking at
the Greek,
his own reflection. So it all comes from people. Why? Because we are very much the same in many of the qualities we recognize in each other, or as my book points out, we should recognize in each other, and that we even recognize in ourselves. Because think about it, growing up, there's an element of self-centeredness that is innate. We learn to play well with others as we get older, but especially if there's a calamity, if there's a tragedy, if we're threatened, we do have that animalistic instinct where we are in a corner, fight or flight. We still have a little bit of that because, as my friend Gavin DeBecker says in The Gift of Fear, we are innately gifted with the ability to preserve ourselves. Now, if you look at the dark tetrad, there's a little bit of self-preservation in each of those, but to the extent that we wouldn't want to have too much in society. But the reason I wrote this book, one of the reasons, is not only do we have people in society that exhibit at least some characteristics of some of these dark personalities, but they hide behind a veneer. The illusion of good is one of the things I talk about in the book. There's this illusion that they've crafted and carefully cultivated, image management, brand management even, because remember, famous people can be carrying around characteristics of some of these dark tetrad qualities that we can't see unless we know what to look for. You know how it is, don't you, Eric? It's always those around us, our loved ones, our parents, our friends, our kids. They sometimes are the first ones to see the red flags. We downplay, we deflect. Oh no, that you have them all wrong. That's not really what she's about. When actually they've got reading glasses on and we're the ones wearing rose-colored glasses.
You know what? Okay, I think it was actually Gavin DeBecker, since his name came up, but it's an interesting point that I believe he talked about our pets, because that's always a good tell how our pets react to somebody. But what was fascinating about that and illuminating by what he said, and I don't know if you found, is that it's not that the pets are detecting the evil or whatever in the person. The pets are reacting to you. So you're blithely going da, 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 but instinctively, you know there's a problem. That's the whole premise behind Gift of Fear. And it's so strong that you're actually feeding it off to your pet, but you are overriding your own instinct like a moron the entire time. And I'm not trying to be, rude, but it's kind of a weird thing how we do corner ourselves, or through politeness and societal and culture, to say, oh, I can't be offensive. Oh, there's probably nothing wrong, or not even do it. But subconsciously, we kind of do know.
Yeah, here's a really good way we can figure this out so we don't have to rely on our pets to decipher our own emotions for us, something like that. Have you ever been in a meeting and somebody walks through the door and all of a sudden you feel yourself tense up. Your heart drops. You were hoping they wouldn't come. Or the phone rings and you look and caller ID is identifying a caller that already has you ready to fight, ready to argue, or just anxious or nervous. If we're dating somebody to whom we're having even a little bit of that response, that's a problem. Or if we're working with them, or if they're watching our kids. And you can see the way, exactly as you point out, Eric, we already know instinctively and subconsciously who is and isn't good for us. You know, young couples often say, he completes me. She brings out the best in me. Is that true? If it is, that's a match made in heaven. That's, you know, I'd say that's the different kind of altar call than we do at my church on Sundays. That is a wonderful feeling to have if it's authentically experienced. But you know what, Eric, if it is, your pets will love your significant other, as will your friends and family. That consistency, you know, the exposure that everyone has. It's kind of like that movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, when there's family members, there's like 50 family members and everybody loves the guy. You know, that's how you know you've made a good choice. And your dog and cat love him too.
Yeah, and there are tells in that. I believe you went into the book too. One of the maneuvers that, shall we say, dark personality will do is to isolate whomever they're with from those around them. And it may be to prevent them from getting that exposure or anything else, but any way to isolate them or isolate a date from everybody around them is probably one of the biggest flags of all, other than I think you mentioned the Waitress Test with one of your examples in the book. And I personally like that one. I forget, it was a SWAT guy and his wife, that early on he was shitty to the waitress. And I really think that that's a major tell, is just see if somebody you're with is mocking other people or with you, taunting them, teasing them, or just treating them bad, because later on that's going to be you.
Yeah, it was the red flags on a first date example. That's exactly right. And if the waitress test is see how somebody treats the waitress, because if it isn't well, that's what you have to look forward to, because the bloom comes off the rose at some point. It shouldn't, and it doesn't always. Again, some couples are matches made in heaven. They really do complete each other. They're soulmates. They're wonderful together. But most of the time, we have flaws. We know what they are instinctively. Maybe we know we have a short temper, or we tend to jump to conclusions, or we're defensive. I mean, everybody has something, because we're a product of our upbringing and the way we were treated growing up. But it's also important when you're embarking upon a serious relationship in business or personally, that you pay very close attention to the way your new friend or acquaintance treats everyone, and particularly how they respond when they're under pressure. And the reason I like the waitress test is the test is, how does this person treat somebody who, at least if it's after the meal, can do nothing for them? How do they treat somebody that takes the trash at night from their building? How do they treat strangers in the subway? You know, that tells you what kind of a person they are, because somebody that has authentic, heartfelt, biblical respect and love for everyone, that's a pretty good choice. Somebody that, regardless of what they've achieved in life, doesn't see themselves as better than anybody else. And there are plenty of people like that who are at the very top of the food chain. I love reading these stories that sometimes you see in the news about these anonymous donors that have the money or the goods or the resources to share, and do it because they're cheerful givers, as it says in the Bible. So when you're on a first date and you already have your table mate, your dinner partner treating somebody badly, I would say there shouldn't be a second, because it's only a matter of time.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the generous people. I don't know if you remember, Ross Perot died, I want to say within the past couple of years. But right after he passed, all this stuff kind of came out about him, and in a good way, that he quietly, like he owned a jet and somebody had a problem with their kid or whatever. And he was like, yeah, just sent the jet over to go pick him up, take the kid in for medical care, pay all this stuff. I mean, and it just came out after, he passed. Nobody ever talked about, he never talked about it. And it was like he dumped millions of dollars just sort of quietly helping people all over the place.
Love
And
that.
it's always really cool to see, it's like that's an awesome legacy. And
It's a
nice
great
surprise.
legacy. It's like the antithesis of the individuals we were speaking of that sparked the naming of the dark personalities. And isn't it interesting that throughout his lifetime, that never came up? Nowadays with social media, you would think somebody would have known about it and come forward. And it just makes us recognize the value. We're always naming and shaming instead of praising. And that would be something that we should probably do more of a regular basis. It's sort of like somebody does something for you at work and you make sure their supervisor knows about it. I mean, you have made a friend for life if that is the way you operate in recognizing excellence. And that's another very big tell that you're dealing with green lights. My book ends, as you know, with green lights also. We tend to say, oh, trust but verify, be very suspicious, be very afraid. But actually, one of the more surprising things I share, having been a prosecutor for over 2 decades, is that doing that work day in and day out has taught me that most people are good. People say, oh, aren't you jaded? And you see all these terrible things. For every child that goes missing, thousands join the search. For every home that burns down in an arson, hundreds of people donate to help them rebuild. Good is so much more powerful than evil in our world. That is one of the perspectives that I like to end the book with, to recognize we've talked about all these red flags. Let's look at these green lights. Some people are so good, so generous, so giving, so authentic. You want to be friends with them and you want to have relationships with people like this. And guess what? Many of us have relationships like this in our lives. And what a blessing that is.
There's actually an example of that was really interesting. Adam Carolla talked about it, I guess, when he was on the morning radio, that he kind of argued with people that, he didn't worry about it if he accidentally left his wallet somewhere. Oh, somebody will pick it up. It'll be fine, whatever. And as an experiment, they deliberately took a wallet full of money and they would just leave it in different places around the city. And just a random with like a little note in there. And I think at 100%, somebody called the number saying, hey, I found this wallet. And it was just kind of an example of like, if you put it, criminals aren't out there going, ooh, is somebody going to drop the wallet? That most people aren't criminals. You're not, and you're most likely going to get a normal person. So that just kind of made me think of it. It was an interesting experiment.
I think about that every time I retrieve an item from Lost and Found. We bank on people being good, and sometimes even if the item isn't there, we think to ourselves, well, maybe they haven't brought it in yet. Like we even give people excuses then. There's something called the truthfulness bias that you may have heard of, where
Malcolm
it is.
Gladwell wrote about that actually at Talking to Strangers in the latest book.
Yeah. And, the psychologically, it is cognitively more difficult to become suspicious than it is to accept what somebody says with face value. We go to parties and cocktail parties, and now I guess I would say Zoom parties, and we meet different people. We go into breakout rooms. We learn a little bit about each other. We don't go home and log off and Google and fact check everything they said because we believe them. We take them at face value. Now, my book is about the fact that maybe we shouldn't, but the reality is, unless we have all of those red flags and we've known them for a period of time, we usually believe what people tell us. So it's that optimism that actually makes life easier on us some of the time, not like in a Pollyanna way, but just in a way that we believe, we look at humanity and believe that there's good in everyone. Now you've mentioned a couple of examples, Jeffrey Dahmer, where I'm not sure that would hold up, but
it's hard.
Yeah, it is hard when you have these types of examples.
Yeah, I mean, it is really hard because in Malcolm Gladwell's book, we were just talking about that. There was one person who knew that Madoff was, I believe it was a Madoff chapter. He was talking about how this guy knew, and this guy just horrible personality. He did not trust anybody. Nobody really wanted to be around the guy. He's not, it's like if you get to that point where you don't distrust everybody to the nth degree, you kind of are so unpleasant that you're not going to get along in life. So it's a weird balance. It's almost like it's encouraging that there's con people out there, that they can succeed, because if they couldn't succeed, then we would be too hard of a society.
Yeah, and there's lots of people like that who have watched so much television. If it bleeds, it leads. They look at these headlines. They're afraid for their communities and themselves and their loved ones. But to go too far down that road is bad for us mentally. One of the other things that I write, teach, and speak about very much lately is wellness. And one of the themes surrounding every kind of wellness you can imagine, whether it's personally, professionally, mentally, emotionally, physically, is the way you think about other people. Many people think, oh, I can sort of just do my own thing, live alone. Now, we all know loners that seem to do okay, but we weren't created to live on islands. We were created to live in community, and we were created to interact substantively, not just superficially. So sometimes if we allow ourselves to be so paranoid that we really find ourselves avoiding deep conversations, not that we should reveal all sorts of personal information, but just talking about issues of substance are so stimulating to us psychologically that they really make us feel better. And it's actually one of the things that makes us happy. So we're depriving ourselves of our own happiness if, as you say, we just go too far down that road. The pendulum shouldn't swing that far.
True, you get us become embittered or even a crackpot.
Good word.
I just say, it's, well, I mean, you can get into tinfoil hat territory. If you
you don't want to get into the tin hat society.
if you're always looking for evil, I promise you'll find it.
You'll find it, and you may mistake it. That is one of the things I talk about in green lights, is many times we mistake green lights for red flags. Sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes we superimpose malevolent intentions onto people that don't have them, that didn't really mean anything by a statement that they made, that aren't really out to get your job or steal your boyfriend or your girlfriend, that really don't have the designs that you think they do. What you're doing some of the time is we superimpose experiences we've had in the past onto new people when they don't deserve it. But stereotyping is something that we all struggle with. Everybody has this issue of implicit biases because of the way we've been raised, where we were raised, what we heard when we were growing up, whether or not we've been exposed to different types of people. So you're correct in stating that we have to really try to step back and objectively assess this. Make those first impressions count, because that is the only meeting during which you will be most objective.
True. Now, to get to the topic on the book, we're talking red flags, and flag is actually an acronym in the book.
That's right.
And you want to go into what that is?
So just briefly, it stands for focus, lifestyle, associations, and goals. Now, focus, it's not your focus, but the person that you're analyzing. Attention reveals intention. One of the bits of footage that I sometimes use when I teach this topic is some footage from the Boston Marathon bombing, where everybody's watching the race and cheering for their racers. And then here you have the brothers that are just looking about where's the bomb. Their focus is on setting off that bomb, those bombs. They don't care who's in the race. That's not why they're there. So too, some profilers that are very experienced, that are looking for example, terrorist activity at the airport, they're looking for people who are focusing on the exit. They're focused on things that you wouldn't be focused on if you're actually at the airport to travel. So focus is important. In fact, one of the interesting things about the back of the book, the first edition, is they talked about I talk about red flags on a first date. Your body, your brain, or the ball game. What is your date focusing on? That tells you a lot about the intentions. Now, lifestyle is personality revealed. What do we do in our spare time? If you only know somebody from 9 to 5, you only see them in the workplace, you don't know anything about them, at least nothing that would allow you to gauge whether this is somebody you want to be in a relationship with, personally or professionally. Where do they go after work? Do they go to the gym? Do they go to the bar? Do they go to an arcade? How do they spend time that's theirs? When the whistle blows at I always used to laugh that in big cities, you think that the fire alarms went off because of the massive humanity that comes pouring out those front doors, ready to get on with the rest of their life. It is that time that tells you what you need,
Right.
what you need to know about somebody.
Or I would say their life itself, their real life.
Exactly.
Work doesn't feel like it sometimes.
Well, what do they say? If you love what you do, you don't work a day in your life.
Oh, sure.
You seem to have a job where that actually may be true. I've watched some of your episodes and you do a very good job and you enjoy yourself. But not everybody has a job that they love. If you do, then maybe your lifestyle is more similar on and off the job. Associations, not just guilty by association, but birds of a feather, the company we keep. We can tell a lot about somebody by who they surround themselves with. We say to our kids, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. Well, maybe that's not just true for kids. Maybe it is true for adults, and it is. And that's what I talk about there. And then goals. Goals is about if we knew more about each other in terms of what we wish for, we dream for, we pray for at night. If you knew what somebody wished for as they saw a falling star or tossed a coin into a wishing well, if people still do that, think about everything you would learn about that person. If you knew what they prayed for before they went to bed that night, you would learn lots of things, personal things about that person that probably drives a lot of the rest of their behavior. So when you look at those four things, you learn a little bit about what the person is like below the surface, the person behind the persona. Very important to go deeper.
Well, sure. And back to associations, it makes me think we've got the birds of a feather flock together. And there's also the famous Jim Rohn line that you are the sum of your 5 closest friends.
I've heard that too. That's a good one.
and that's on the positive end. I always try to say that I treat it like real estate. You want to be the worst house in the best neighborhood.
Right. Well, it's interesting you say real estate because I talk about in the book how you can have a home that is so visually pleasing and apparently well kept on the outside, but could be an absolute disaster zone on the inside because you can't Ariel Castro is a great example of that. He's also a great example, by the way, of some of the other chapters I talk about regarding familiarity, breeding contentment. This is the axe murderer next door syndrome. I didn't really know him. He seemed like a nice guy, but he kept to himself. That's not a very good neighbor. We should know our neighbors so we won't be surprised or we'll see red flags if there are any. You don't want to send your son or daughter out selling Girl Scout cookies to next door neighbors that you don't know. But yes, it can just be a facade. And that's why we need to have 4 ways of reading red flags, not just one, not just looking.
True. But then I'm in the thing too, where you get too close to the neighbors, you wind up in a dispute between them. So there's a cynical side to that, I have to confess.
Well, isn't that true? Some people make the jokes that they've never seen more heated arguments than they do at homeowners association meetings. I mean, homeowners and school board, I guess the sparks really fly at those types of meetings. But there should be a level of comfort with your neighbors, especially nowadays. Neighborhood watch, as I always say, doesn't work if no one's watching. Because who is watching is the bad guys. And if we don't protect each other, if we don't collectively and communally vow to make sure we protect each other's children and each other, we're not going to stand a chance because criminals are crafty. They're flying drones and they're scoping us out in more ways than one. I mean, I don't know about our listeners and viewers if they use Nextdoor Neighbor and the Ring cameras. I am always amazed at the types of things that are shared and how quickly they're shared. I mean, we wake up and we have something shared that happened 3 streets away. Look at who was at my door last night. Did anybody else see him? I mean, neighborhood watch is a beautiful thing if we actually do what we say we're doing.
True. The Ring can get almost overwhelming.
I know. You gotta really share that thing, right? People share every moving pet or animal that walks. I mean, raccoons, coyotes. Yeah, most of it's that, isn't it?
It can. Yeah, it can be. There's another level of worry though too about whether sharing it or not sharing it and privacy, and there's so many different considerations on that. You have some interesting examples that in your career that I think are fascinating. Like I don't know if this is a case you dealt with, but you had a juror who married a defendant after she prosecuted him for murder, but did not prosecute or did not vote on the death penalty. Was the vote holding off that? What help?
Well, I've had the experience of jurors really becoming infatuated with criminal defendants. But the marriage example, that wasn't from one of my cases, but that was from many cases. If you look at the literature, there are many examples. And I mean, to use the word many, that is shocking in and of itself, of people that sat on juries and then ended up following up with defendants. And there are a variety of reasons that people do this. And the literature on this has to do with sort of the bond that's formed in a courtroom between the parties, even when they never have any contact. I mean, zero. You can't have jurors having any contact with a criminal defendant. But what happens? They're in a controlled environment. They're learning about someone's life. Sometimes they become fascinated. I mean, remember how many people sat in the gallery to watch the Night Stalker's trial, and how many women afterwards wanted to marry the Night Stalker? I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer is another example of that, by the way. This happens in the most sensational of cases. And it happens, by the way, even if the defendants are not themselves very attractive. It happens with men, with women, doesn't matter with the gender of the person on trial. It is the type of thing that really is, I don't want to say maybe a darker side of human nature, but a morbid curiosity that piques the interest of those that would never in a million years think they would ever have any attraction. Now, the attraction is not to the crime most of the time. It's that they may be the one to save this person, that maybe they'll be the one that finally connects. I mean, because remember, when you sit through a criminal trial, especially if it goes to a death phase, those jurors are about to sit there and listen to all these mitigation witnesses that have talked about all the tough things that happened in this person's past that made them into the monster they are today, paraphrasing. But those are the types of things that really resonate with many jurors. Nobody, none of us, no matter what side of the case you're on, want to hear that somebody had all this trauma in childhood. All of us feel for that person. But the question for the jury isn't whether or not they feel bad that this person had to deal with that, but does it excuse or mitigate the murder? So sometimes jurors, that just stays with them and they desire contact post-trial.
So wild. And I've had somebody who studies hybristophiles on, and I have a theory to run by you. I've run it by other psychologists, and it's that female teachers and some of these death row groupies or whatever, serial killer groupies, are similar in a power paradigm. Like, I'm wondering if they are attracted to this truly deviant, dangerous person because they're safe. They have the biggest monster in the world, but it's a controlled circumstance where they can't be harmed because they're in a cage, so it's like they're the ultimate safety. And then a female teacher, same principle, she has the power over the student.
I think one of the distinctions that I would make, and that I do make in the book, because I have prosecuted teachers that have been having sex with their students, is that in the teacher-student scenario, there is no cage, and there is often a future relationship. I mean, Mary Kay Letourneau is, of course, the biggest example of that. The woman that went on to marry a young man that was in one of her classes. I think now they got divorced. I can't keep up with these romance, high-profile couplings. But the fact that in that scenario, power is exploited is a little bit different than the other scenario. But I'll tell you what's the same, Eric, what is very much the same, and what actually we can look at in a similar fashion is what I have in one of my chapters is the Temptation of Taboo. These are the ultimate unholy pairings, the absolute, yet they happen with regularity. So you have to wonder, how does somebody get themselves into a situation like that to begin with? And then when they do, what is the allure to continue down a path that everybody in society, most everybody, totally disapproves of? If you are stealth dating, you should take a closer look at that relationship, because secrets don't breed relational satisfaction. And if you have to hide, maybe you should really take a second look at what you're doing to begin with.
Yeah, and that would go both ways too. Like if you're having an affair with somebody who's married, well, then you'll be replaced later too. In my mind,
Yeah.
it,
How did relationships start? Absolutely. And in fact, if a relationship started even as a business relationship and your prospective business partner intentionally fails to tell the server that something was left off the menu that he or she should have paid for,
mm,
that's going to be the way they're treating your finances down the line. So we're back to the waitress test. I guess we have to call it the server test nowadays, but we're back to that. It is the way in which relationships begin. Like I said, first impressions, maximize first impressions that give us the types of red flags that will become even more relevant for us down the line.
yeah, and I don't mind repeating that same test. I mean, in a rude way, it's like the little people test or whatever you want. It's another power paradigm
Right.
scenario. How
Good.
do you act? How does this person act if they're in power or they have power over somebody else? Are they cruel? Are they open? Are they kind? What are they? Because you're right, there's nothing that can be gained, and they hold all the power. They have the waitress or waiter or whomever trying to get a tip, trying to finish a transaction, working for them. Do they abuse them or are they kind? Are they fair? There's a lot to be told in those.
Benevolent leadership is one of the green flags that I talk about in the book. There are so many leaders that are mentors and role models. Leadership has not, and power has not gone to their head, nor has it tended to corrupt. And that is one of the things that we notice about leaders. You know, there are so many, I mean, you and I could do this podcast on any day of the week and we would have examples in the news to use. So I'm not going to name names. So hopefully this will be an evergreen episode here. But there are so many headlines about people in power that have abused their power one way or another. Maybe it's just cutting corners. Maybe it's financially. Maybe it's sexual harassment. I mean, the list goes on and on. Yet, there are also leaders that do not ever suffer from scandals. They are the types of leaders that you hope are doing these after school programs and mentoring young people because they want to invest and pour into the lives of others to raise up a class of leaders that can take the reins after they're gone. So like you, with the example of the lost and found, there are so many leaders that are good. Sometimes the tone at the top is actually a tone that you want to follow and learn from.
Well, you're in California, and I think you've probably had to deal with celebrities to a degree just in the nature of your job. And I've heard that some of them are actually extraordinarily generous and amiable. You know, some of the really, really high, you know, like A+ list players or whatever who have made it, who you think they could be totally divas or whatever, and they're actually pretty down to earth and pretty cool. Like they've been beaten up the whole way up and they understand, you know, what they have is sort of a blessing. Have you observed any of that?
Oh, yes. You know, where I've met more celebrities than anywhere else is in green rooms at news studios like Fox and
Mm.
CNN getting ready to go on air because oftentimes they're in there getting their makeup done too. And I have to tell you, you remember the Happy Days, the Fonz, when we
Oh,
were
Henry
growing up?
Winkler's legendary as a
And Henry Winkler stands out. As soon as you ask the question, he stands out as one of the celebrities I met in a green room. That was the most gracious, just a humble person that was only there to make sure everyone else was comfortable. It was just tremendous. And you think someone that famous with that kind of a life is just so other focused. And I've met other celebrities in the same vein, including news personalities that, you know, sort of have this tough on air presence, but are
mm.
just so gracious and wonderful. Nancy Grace is one of them that I work with on
Ah,
an almost weekly basis. That is just, she's very tough. She's tough as nails on air. She's a prosecutor and she's there to achieve justice for the victims and such a gracious, warm person. And I could go on and on. The list goes on. And it's
I heard that
probably,
about Hannity. That Hannity is really kind of abrasive as a host, but personally, everybody really likes him,
yeah.
including
And
supposed enemies, you know, or whatever.
and let me pick up on that last point. Isn't that the test? when those that you really go head to head with on air, you are friendly with off air. And that is true for me with so many different types of commentators that I debate issues with. We are dear friends off air. I mean, we ride to the station together in the same car. Very, very good friends. And that's actually part of lawyering, though, isn't it? It's the ability to discuss issues and not make it personal. You know, I always cringe when I'm watching television and I see combatants that have different viewpoints that make it personal. It's never about you and I if we're on the air together. It's about the issues, and discussion is stimulating. I mean, we live in a country where we're allowed to exist in a marketplace of ideas. And sometimes, you know, I'll come out of a segment saying, I never thought of that. So guess who won that argument? I suppose I'm the one that came out ahead because I learned something, and it was all done above board, and we're still friendly at the end. So I think your comment about respecting those that you disagree with is a good one. That should always, ideally, be the way we exchange ideas.
Well, and I have a lot of lawyers on the show.
I know you
I'm
do.
not a lawyer. I just, for whatever reason, I don't know. I should probably have my head
Because
checked.
we like to talk, and we can talk with you for an hour. No problem.
Well, there's that, and I'm a big believer in free speech, and I love debate. And what I think is fun about the cool lawyers is you guys treat verbal jousting as a sport. You know, so you mentioned it's like, yeah, you'll have a just knock, you know, an argument online, but you're like, ooh, that was a good one. Darn, I got to get one. And it's not, it is absolutely not personal. I feel like when it's going right, it's like we're expressing points, but you're almost, you know, just you're having a bit of a bout, if you will.
Yeah, and you know what else really helps that? And this is something else I talk in the book is chemistry. So there are many opponents that I spar with on air with whom I enjoy amazing chemistry. So we were in the green room together beforehand and afterwards, and we just have such respect and affection for each other that it makes everything that happens on air just fun for the audience to watch. I'm often asked, you know, you guys friends, you really seem like you get along behind the scenes. And when you don't know somebody, sometimes our guard is up a little bit, you know, back to the pet test, as you mentioned earlier. And others, viewers, listeners, are responding to us and responding to our discomfort. Whereas when you begin to warm up and you know somebody a little better, maybe you even research them beforehand, and you kind of start with well, so-and-so knows because I know she graduated from Harvard. I can't tell you how many times I've used little anecdotes like that, and you just see the other person smile as they begin to relax, thinking, okay, this lady's not going to take my head off. Maybe we're actually going to enjoy this spirited debate, because that's what it is. As you know, that's what lawyers do. It's spirited debate. You're not persuasive if you're defensive and antagonistic and argumentative. You're persuasive if you seem to be gracious enough to understand, well, of course you have the superior position, so there's no reason for you to be defensive. There's all kinds of strategy involved, but we enjoy it more. And I even say this to people that debate with family members. I mean, we debate with our kids and our teenagers, don't we, as we negotiate as to what they are or aren't allowed to do, how much FaceTime they get, and whether your little ones have to really eat that last carrot before they get dessert, or can they just cut it in half and have. I mean, negotiation and debate is something we do both personally and professionally. But it's the way we do it. And it's also what makes us trust one another, is if we have enough chemistry to be able to understand, we are still going to be affectionate friends at the end of the day.
True. And I've got a super chat here. This is probably going back to earlier, but it's true. Relevant past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. Yeah, I think so. Unless somebody actually turns on it. And as you put it, in terms of debating or jousting or whatever, or sparring, I think humor is so important. Having a sense of humor, and not necessarily being a comedian or being hilarious, just being able to kind of get a joke, or don't think so highly of yourself that you can't be enjoying the moment. Well, and I think that's where you see the real sparks, because you'll see a twinkle in the eye when they, oh, well, what about,
There is nothing that makes a sparring contest or a debate easier than when someone cracks a joke. That's true too in the courtroom. If something funny happens and the jury laughs, all of a sudden everybody's blood pressure drops. And physiologically, we know why that's true. In fact, when I teach my public speaking classes, I always say, before you go on, think of something that honestly and authentically makes you crack up. Because what does that do? That relaxes every muscle in your body. Your brain is better, you're better. And if you can recreate that in any conversation, especially tough conversations, it's going to go so much easier. But starting with it before tempers flare is really the key, because it's easier to ensure that tempers don't get out of control than it is to bring down the temperature once they have.
True. And it puts them on their back foot, if you will. It's if you walk in, and I'm curious because you've been both prosecutor and a defense attorney. And I know you in the book, you spent some time talking about that, how you try to have a rapport with expert witnesses, almost especially if they're in the opposition. Do you want to go into that a little?
Well, this advice can be used with anybody who is seeking, who knows they have to have a difficult conversation with somebody who they know is diametrically opposed to them. You're not always diametrically opposed to anybody on everything. I mean, we share far more common ground. Like we always say in politics, there's much more that unites us than divides us. When dealing with somebody that has superior skill, talent, expertise, there's no getting around recognizing that. So when I'm cross-examining an expert witness, I am not going to win on skill, technique, and credentials. That's the reason this person was called by my opposing party, so they could tell the jury what they think about the case. And of course, I have my own experts, so it's a battle of the experts. But in terms of the dynamic of cross-examination, there is nothing wrong with being complimentary or even showing admiration for the accomplishments that somebody has in their life. Because what are you doing? You're appealing to them as a person. I guarantee you there is no expert witness that takes the stand anywhere in the world that isn't touched and impacted and affected when the opponent actually authentically is recognizing excellence. Obviously, you're going to attack the foundation for the opinion, but that doesn't mean you're attacking the person and their credentials or how many years they spent in school or what they gave up to both raise a family and pursue all of this education that makes them an expert in what they're testifying about. So creating that dynamic, I used to have a paralegal after an examination would say, are the two of you going to have dinner tonight? Because you really do create chemistry. Now, that helps us as lawyers because we get better testimony that we can then use in closing argument. You don't get any good testimony if you just come out of the gate swinging. If anything, you shut it down. But you are able to gain concessions that don't necessarily hurt the other side, but help you. It's a win-win to be able to have that dynamic in front of a jury. And I would say the same thing in a business meeting. These techniques work from the boardroom to the courtroom and to the classroom. If you have students that you are trying to negotiate with or get to behave a little bit better, there is nothing wrong than that first recognizing the good, the levels of agreement, the areas of cohesion, and then moving to the areas where your paths diverge.
Okay, well, if you focus on the 80% you agree on or whatever it is, does that make it easier for you to help reframe what they're saying? Like, okay, we're all together here. We agree, we agree, we agree, we agree. And then instead of just saying, no, that's wrong, just saying, well, what if we look at it at this slight other angle? Is it possible? And fill in the blank. Is that some of what you're trying to do there, to where it's like at least getting them to admit that an alternative thing is possible, even though you're not going to directly attack their statement?
Yes.
Just
and
trying to get that.
Absolutely. And I'm going to bring in the pet example again. I'm so glad you brought that up. It's the way you do it too, Eric. It's the words. Words are important. Words matter, as we say, but it's also your body language and your demeanor, because that is what the other person is going to react to subconsciously, innately. They're either going to be threatened or they're going to feel comfortable. You're approachable no matter what you're saying if you have that demeanor. It's kind of like back to the pets. You can look at your dog and you can say, I'm going to chop you up and eat you for dinner tonight. And your dog will wag its tail and the ears go back. because your demeanor is expressing one thing when your words express another. By the way, that can also be a red flag. I call it counterintuition in the book, where the mannerisms don't match the message. But when you're trying to engage in negotiation, or you're trying to ingratiate yourself with somebody, or simply get along, you can't always escape the difficult people in your life. Sometimes they live in the same house. So the words are important, but so is the way you express yourself. So no defensive mannerisms, no bullying, no standing on top of somebody else, but just a very open manner of communicating speaks volumes before you even say a word.
Yeah, I think it was Maya Angelou who said that people never remember what you say, but they remember how you made them feel.
Yes. Yes. And that, of course, can be both a red flag and a green light, which is why you need to get to know somebody. But also, I also teach on difficult people, and I call the segment how to win over difficult people. And a lot of it has to do with the reality that if you find somebody difficult, so does everybody else. And then there's the big joke about if you can't find 5 difficult people in your life, there's 1 in every 6, then that means the finger's pointing back at you. You're the one. But when you deal with people that are already difficult, you may be the first one they've come across in whatever setting you're interacting with them in, who has responded so graciously and shown kindness and patience and willingness to listen to their perspective, whether or not you agree with it. So these are some of the ways in which we can actually negotiate, deal with, and even become friends with even the most difficult people in life.
I guess I'm weird. I get along with difficult people probably better than normal people.
Well, then I'm going to wait to read your book next, because that is something that we can all learn from too.
Most of the difficult people, I feel, are experts, and they're impatient, and they either feel aggrieved that people haven't really listened to them, or they have no patience whatsoever. Sometimes it's, I don't want to say spectrum or, but it's a matter of just going at them. One being like, oh, you're not really going to bother me, and I could take you or leave you. That's one approach. I don't know. It's hard to explain.
Well, with expertise comes a level of not necessarily arrogance, but assertiveness. I mean, many people know something about whatever it is they've had to deal with in life. Maybe it's having battled an illness. Maybe it's having overcome some sort of a terrible tragedy. Maybe you've lost a loved one. Or maybe, like some of these expert witnesses, you've spent, 25 years in pursuing a certain discipline. You formed a niche. We call it the side niche, right? Something you can even do if you're employed elsewhere, and you're an expert on that. So when you're faced with maybe somebody questioning you in that regard, we automatically get defensive, where sometimes I have found that people asking questions may have very good points that, despite us living, breathing, working, researching a particular issue for years, we haven't thought of. We end up in a silo if we're not open to the fact that others may have had different experiences with the very issue that forms the basis of our own expertise. So there you go back to what do our parents tell us about the 5-second rule, not how long something can be on the ground before you can pick it up and eat it, but how long you should wait before you react. So I'm a big fan. In fact, I think you should probably wait much longer than 5 seconds. But wait, make sure you heard them, make sure that you're not reacting out of pride, and that with humility, you actually consider what they said. Now, maybe they have it all wrong, but maybe they don't. And it's never a bad thing to think before you speak.
Right. Now I got a super chat that is in line with this, which I totally agree with too. One should take into account the similarity of situations, time period, how much the person may have changed, how habitual the behavior might be. And that's why it must be behavior that is recent and relevant.
Right. Recent and relevant is very important because people change. I talk about that too. I talk about the green flash, which is something that I've been looking at the horizon, waiting to see my whole life, still never seen it. But sometimes there's a flash of green in a sea of waving red, and that stands for the proposition that people can change. And over the years, we are mellowed by many things that happen in our lives. We get over ourselves, as I always say in my profession. You get out of law school and you're like running to the courthouse with your briefcase in one hand and I would say a yellow pad in another, because we didn't have the internet when I started practicing law. But then over the years, and it's not just because, you get ganged up on and you lose so many times, but we just mature in a fashion that what may have been personality dispositions that we carried when we were younger, we just don't have anymore. We've accepted the fact that we are sort of a work in progress, regardless of how old we are. So your viewer makes a very good point. It's more about what have you done for me lately than what did you do in high school, because you're not the person you were in high school. You're probably much more likely the person you were last week. So if you failed the waitress test last week, I'd say that red flag is still flying.
Right. It's wisdom is attained. And to wrap up, you have a great story about a person that you bring into the classroom that people don't necessarily expect, and
That's right.
it gets their attention later.
So I teach business ethics at night at college level, and I have a guest speaker. I know, yeah. I use 24 hours in a day, and you got to try to use most of them. But I bring in this guest speaker that really walks through the door, wearing a watch that costs more than my car, just really dripping with swag and credibility. And everybody kind of looks like, who's this guy? What's he going to talk about? And then he would share that he was so thrilled to be able to come and speak to the class because he just finished his prison sentence. And I'll tell you what, I saw 60 heads snap up from their smartphones or whatever else they were doing. All of a sudden, I had the attention of everyone in the class. Wouldn't it be great if we as educators could naturally command that type of attention? But then went on to tell the students, he wished there was a business ethics class when he was in college because of everything that he wished that he would have known, even about cutting corners that don't seem that significant in the moment. And that credibility, again, that's cultivated through a tough experience. But he is now one of the most coveted speakers any ethics class could have from the perspective of actually having been there. Sort of like a recovering alcoholic is such a powerful speaker to those that are currently trapped within the throes of addiction, because there's that credibility of having walked in your shoes. You can't just say, oh, I know how you feel, if you really don't. So it's experiences like that that make us who we are as well.
So who's this guy?
Well, I don't know if he would want me to disclose publicly, but I'll just say a very, very successful, including today, real estate person and real estate professional. And I would even say real estate expert, because we were talking about expertise that I lost track of him, but boy, I always used to make the joke with him is he just stole all my evaluations. People would say, what was the best thing about the class? And they would say the guest speaker. He was just that good. And I brought him back semester after semester because I learned from him along with everybody else.
That's my whole show.
Yeah.
You guys are the best thing about the show. I just quantify it.
And you're just shining green lights all over the place right now. I'll tell you, Eric, you really are. So thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And people can find out more on your website, wendypatrickphd.com.
That's it.
You have a column in Psychology Today, and wow, a lot of writing there. Why Bad Looks Good. And of course, I really do encourage everybody to get the book, Red Flags, Frenemies, Underminers, and Ruthless People. And it's an audio because I have to have everything in audio. I just don't have time to actually sit there and read it, but definitely check it out. It's a lot of fun. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Eric.